Oh, I stared at the screen, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The photo was bright and crisp. Julia, my youngest daughter, stood in the center, her arm looped tightly around Maya, who was glowing in her engagement dress. My son-in-law grinned beside them. Even my ex-husband's second wife had made it into the shot. But I hadn't. My hands went cold. I looked again. The backdrop was unmistakable: Julia's backyard. The maple tree I helped plant when Maya was 6 leaned in just slightly to the left. They were just 10 minutes away. I scrolled. 27 comments? Beautiful family, what a moment! Wishing you all the happiness! Not a single mention of me. My chest tightened, like something inside me was being slowly cinched shut. I tapped the photo, as if zooming in might reveal a corner of myself tucked somewhere in the background. A glimpse of my shoulder, a blur of my sleeve. Nothing. I clicked into the caption. Yesterday's engagement celebration. Just immediate family? Immediate family? I reached for my phone, thumbs trembling slightly, and texted Julia. Me, I saw the photo. Did I miss the party? Her reply came fast. Julia, oh, we had it yesterday. It was kind of spontaneous. Just the immediate family, Mom. Hope you're well. Hope you're well. The same woman I'd nursed through mono at 15. The same one whose first apartment deposit I'd covered. The same girl who used to fall asleep on my chest when thunderstorms shook our windows. Now she called me Mom, like a distant obligation. The house was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the air more stale. The smell of last night's stew still lingered, sour and heavy. I looked around. The framed photo of Tom and me on our 30th anniversary, dusty now. A vase of fading chrysanthemums on the windowsill. The bench in the yard he built before his cancer took over. I sat down slowly, as if any sudden movement would shatter the air. Had I become invisible? Not just skipped, not just forgotten, but consciously left out. After all the years, the overnight shifts, the birthday cakes made from scratch, the tuition checks, the emergency babysitting, the holidays hosted, the sacrifices that stacked up until I forgot what my own needs even looked like. And now I was outside the frame. The silence pressed in tighter, my phone buzzed again. Maya, Grandma! Sorry you couldn't come yesterday. It was really last minute. You would have loved it. Love you! A kiss on the cheek after the doors already closed. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the drawer near the hallway where I kept old paperwork. My knees ached, my fingers, stiffer than last winter. I pulled out the folder marked WellRL 2017. I held it for a long while. Then I opened it. The pages felt heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was different now. Maybe something in me had shifted. I traced the signature lines. Equal distribution to Julia and Thomas Bell. Executor Julia Simmons. My own name was in there, yes? But I no longer recognized the woman who had signed it. The one who still believed that love would come back around if you just kept giving. I closed the folder, not yet. But soon, my chair creaked as I rose. Outside, the wind rattled the dying leaves against the kitchen window. The late October light cast long shadows across the table. I wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside me had cracked. And once that happens, you don't just patch it up. You build something new. Something better. Something that doesn't leave you waiting for an invitation that never comes. The light in the hallway shifted golden, brushing against the edges of the photo frames that lined the wall. I moved slowly past them one by one. Tom in uniform holding Maya the day she was born. Julia in her second grade play, paper crown sliding over one ear. Our family at the lake, 20 years ago. The sun in that shot was brutal. I remembered reapplying sunscreen to everyone but myself. I'd gotten burned that day, but still grilled hot dogs while the rest of them swam. I had spent so much of my life behind the scenes. As a nurse, I was trained to anticipate what people needed before they ask. I brought that same instinct home. A fever caught in the middle of the night. I had meds ready before the thermometer beeped. Lost lunchbox. I packed an extra. Every Band-Aid, every form signed, every sleepless night. I stored it in my bones like muscle memory. Tom used to joke I could run the country with just a clipboard and a phone call. He was the one person who saw me fully, effortlessly. He'd rub my shoulders when I came home after 12 hours on my feet, and he'd whisper, "You're the engine. None of this moves without you." He died 6 years ago, just before Thanksgiving. He collapsed while changing a light bulb. I still remember the scream that tore from me when I found him on the floor. The cold of the tile. The sound of the ambulance doors closing. The kids came home that year, of course. Everyone said the right things. "He was so proud of you, Mom. You were his whole world." Then they left, and I stayed. With his boots still by the back door, with the bench he built and the garden he planted. With the quiet that filled every drawer, every hallway. Sometimes I wondered if part of me stopped moving too. But I kept going. For them, I never remarried. Never traveled like I said I would. I kept my shifts longer than I should have. Just in case someone needed me, it never occurred to me to ask who I needed. I was the mother. That was the job, and now somehow I was an afterthought in the very story I helped build. Some nights, I'd lie awake and think about the little promises I'd folded up and stored away. The scrapbook trip to Maine I never took. The garden shed I wanted to turn into a studio. The piano lessons I gave up after Julia started school.
Tom used to call them my summer days.
Some a day, he'd say, brushing my hair back. You'll have a space with morning light and too many books. I'd laugh and tell him, that sounds expensive. He'd reply, so what? You're worth it? But someday never came. There was always a recital, a mortgage payment, an overtime shift someone else couldn't take. I told myself it was fine. That motherhood was a legacy. That being needed was its own kind of reward. But lately, I'd been asking questions I never dared before. Did they remember the nights I sat up with them when they were sick? The handmade Halloween costumes? The way I worked 3 holidays in a row so we could afford Julia's braces? Or had I just become wallpaper, useful? Until I wasn't. I opened the hall closet and ran my hand along the shelf where Tom used to keep the flashlights. My fingers brushed something cool, his old thermos. I unscrewed the lid slowly. The faint scent of coffee and metal hit me like memory. Tom used to write notes on napkins and tuck them into my lunch. Little things. You've got this, Meg. Breathe. You always figure it out. I hadn't saved the napkins, but I remembered every word. Maybe that was the difference. I remembered everything, and I wasn't sure anyone remembered me. The casserole dish was still warm when I placed it on Julia's counter. Chicken and wild rice. Her favorite. I'd even used the fancy paprika she liked, went to 2 stores for it, because the local one stopped carrying the brand she preferred. She didn't look up from her phone. I stood there for a second, waiting. Then, finally, you didn't have to bring anything, Mom. Her tone wasn't grateful. It was sharp, like I'd broken some unspoken rule. I thought you said you were tired of cooking lately? I offered.
I am, she replied,
Tapping her screen. But we already ordered from that new place on Maple. Oh, I said. I held the dish with both hands, unsure whether to put it in the fridge or take it back to my car. Then came the sting. Honestly, Mom, you showing up with food all the time, it's kind of a lot. Like, we're not helpless? My mouth opened before I had a thought ready to fill it. Julia didn't even glance up. She was still scrolling. Maya was upstairs, music playing faintly. The house smelled like new candles and delivery food. I set the dish down gently on the stove atop. I just thought it might help, I said. You've been busy? You always think that? She muttered. I froze. I always think what? That I should help? That they'd appreciate it? She sighed. I don't want Maya thinking that the way to show love is by constantly overdoing. It's overwhelming, and sometimes performative. That word landed like a slap. Performative, as if 3 decades of quiet dinners, 6 a.m. lunchbox packing, staying up with fevers, and holding back tears after Tom's funeral were just for show. A wave of heat crept up my neck. I pressed my hands against my coat pockets to steady them. I didn't mean to overwhelm anyone, I said softly. Julia finally looked at me. It's just, we're trying to build our own rhythm now, and it feels like you're always inserting yourself. I nodded, though I didn't understand it. Not really. Insert myself. I was her mother. This used to be my house, my kitchen. I used to measure Maya's growth on the edge of that pantry door. I used to matter here. Got it? I said. I won't bring anything next time. There won't be a next time for a while, she added. We've got a lot going on. My casserole dish sat and touched on the stove, steam rising and fading like breath in cold air. I didn't ask what they had going on. I didn't ask if I could help. I just picked up my coat from the back of the chair, where no one had offered to hang it, and walked out. The casserole sat on the passenger seat, its foil cover fogged from the last of the steam. I hadn't said anything when Julia turned back to her phone, just walked out the door, pulling it closed behind me. Not a hug, not even a thank you. The porch light flickered as I stepped down the stairs. One bulb out. I'd changed that bulb myself years ago. Tom had shown me how, just in case. The drive home was quiet. The heater in the car rattled slightly when I turned it on. I kept my hands at 10 and 2, eyes fixed ahead, but my mind drifted sideways. Overdoing it, performative, inserting myself. each word circled like a bird that wouldn't land. I pulled into the driveway and didn't get out right away. The street was still. My porch light glowed soft yellow against the frost creeping up the edges of the steps. I sat there in the dark, engine off, listening to the tiny ticking sounds of the car cooling down. The casserole had gone cold beside me. I hadn't even wanted to make it. But I thought, maybe if I showed up with something warm, they'd see me, not just as the woman who watches from the sidelines, but as part of them. The house greeted me with its usual hush. I locked the door behind me, slid my coat onto the hook, and carried the casserole straight to the fridge. There was already one in there from last week. I hadn't thrown it out yet. I stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter, and looked around at the silence. No one needed a ride. No one needed dinner. No one needed me. I thought of Maya. When she was 6, she used to draw me hearts on napkins. She'd sneak them into my purse, write, "Best grandma ever," in glitter pen. I still had one tucked inside a book on the shelf.
Back then I was magical.
Necessary. Wanted. And now? Now I was a presence they tolerated. As long as I stayed small and quiet. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment. The hum of the refrigerator was louder than I expected. In the quiet, something shifted. It wasn't rage, not even sadness. It was subtraction, like realizing a piece of you had quietly been removed and nobody bothered to mention it. I went upstairs without unpacking my bag, without turning on the TV, without touching the old photo albums on the side table. I lay down on top of the covers, shoes still on, and I stared at the ceiling, thinking, if I stopped showing up altogether, would anyone notice? The envelope was already opened when Julia handed it to me. "Just something I need you to review," she said, like she was asking me to taste soup. We were sitting at her dining table. I hadn't been over since the casserole. The smell of lavender air freshener was stronger than I remembered. Overhead, a pendant light buzzed faintly. Maya wasn't home, neither was her fiancé, just us, and the document. "What is this?" I asked, smoothing the folded paper out over the placemat. Julia poured tea, didn't answer right away. "Some updates," she said eventually. "Estate things. For when, you know?" I looked up. "When what?" She gave me a look that was supposed to read gentle, but it didn't land. "Mom, come on. You're not going to live forever. You always said you wanted things to be simple for us." "I did." My voice was flat. The paper felt too thin in my hands. Legalese blurred between bolded lines. Words like durable power of attorney, a joint access of revocable trust. "I thought you already had copies of the will," I said. "This is just more up to date," Julia replied, sipping her tea. "It makes things easier, less paperwork when the time comes." She didn't look at me. Her eyes flicked toward her phone as it buzzed on the counter. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the document. My name? A blank space? A date? "Why is this already signed by you?" I asked. "It's standard," she said. "Just fill in your part and we'll have it notarized." The room felt colder suddenly. Not from temperature, but from recognition. I knew this rhythm. It was the same one I used in the hospital when trying to get a patient to swallow bitter meds. "Distracts often. Push." "I think I'll take this home," I said. "Give it a proper read." Julia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course," she said. "No rush." But I felt the rush. It was there, unspoken, behind the curtain of helpfulness, behind the pastel sweater and the practiced calm. She walked me to the door like a nurse escorting a patient to discharge, polite, efficient, already moving on to the next. When I got in my car, I didn't start it right away. I sat with the document in my lap. The paper was still warm from my hands, but the edges felt sharp. Tom and I had planned everything years ago. Down to the cemetery plots. Down to the percentage each child would receive. Nothing had ever been said about Julia needing control, and yet there it was. In her handwriting, a plan I hadn't approved with my name already printed. I pulled out my phone, opened the calculator app, typed in a few numbers, loan amounts I remembered giving her, the car, the down payment, Maya's first year of college. The total didn't surprise me. The fact that I'd never asked for it back did. And I laid everything out on the dining table like puzzle pieces. Bank statements, old checkbook ledgers, receipts I'd tucked away for, just in case. I even pulled out the notebook Tom and I used when planning our retirement, the one with his handwriting in the margins, little reminders in blue ink. Yes, never tie your money to guilt. Have he'd written that after Julia cried on our porch, asking for help with her second mortgage. I had helped, every time, quietly, without conditions. But looking at the numbers now, I realized something hard. They'd all blurred together into a river flowing one way out. Julia hadn't just leaned on me in hard times. She had built a rhythm of expecting, of assuming, and I had taught her too, with every silent yes, with every unasked question. I picked up the legal document again, the one she'd asked me to sign. It wasn't just power of attorney. It included clauses, ones I hadn't noticed at first, about accessing accounts jointly, deciding disbursements, and managing home equity in the event of declining health. Declining health. I hadn't even missed a doctor's appointment in 3 years. I walked every morning, took care of my own grocery shopping, changed my own smoke detector batteries. This wasn't about health. It was about convenience. About locking in access before I had a chance to say no. I sat back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling. What had once been care now felt like positioning. I reached for my phone and called Ellen. "Do you still have that lawyer's contact?" I asked. There was a pause. Then her calm, steady voice, "You ready?" "I think so," I said. Not to change everything, just to understand what's already been changed. We made a plan to meet the next morning. I hung up and walked to the mirror by the hallway. I looked older than I felt. Not weak, not sick, not fragile, just tired of being seen through a lens of eventual absence. That's what this was, wasn't it? They were preparing for me to disappear, to step aside, to hand over my life before I'd stopped living it. I opened the drawer under the hall table. The one with Tom's old flashlight, a pair of keys to the shed, and our original will in a manila folder. Still signed. Still valid, still mine. I placed Julia's new draft next to it. One folder heavy with history, the other bloated with assumption. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never allowed. What if protecting them meant I'd forgotten to protect myself? I didn't hear from Julia for 2 weeks after that. No calls, no texts, not even a forwarded meme, her usual way of half keeping in touch. I didn't chase her. Instead, I trimmed the hedges, reorganized the pantry, rearranged the books in the living room by author instead of color. I kept busy, but in the quiet moments, especially around 5, when the sun dipped behind the elms and cast long shadows through the window, I found myself glancing at the phone. It stayed still, cold, silent. The Sunday after our conversation, I baked pumpkin bread. I wrapped 2 loaves in foil and set them on the counter. My fingers hovered over my phone, thinking maybe I'd offer one to Maya. She used to love it, called it grandma cake. I never texted. Instead, I unwrapped 1 loaf and had a slice alone with my tea. The other sat untouched for 4 days before I tossed it. A week later, I saw their photos. Julia had posted them on her feed. Maya's bridal shower, dozens of women in pastel dresses, cupcakes with gold lettering, a giant balloon arch spelling, bride-to-be. They were all smiles. And I wasn't in a single frame. Wasn't even in the room. I read the caption twice. Surrounded by love today. So then I scrolled through the comments, each one a tiny paper cut. Beautiful family.
Where's Grandma?
Bet she made the cupcakes. 3 generations of strong women. And I clicked off the screen, set the phone face down on the table, and went to the sink to wash a dish that wasn't dirty. The water ran too hot. I didn't care. The next day, Ellen knocked on my back door with a container of split-pea soup. "You've been too quiet," she said, stepping in without waiting for permission. I managed a smile. "Just nesting," I said. She gave me that look, the one that said, "You don't have to lie to someone who already knows." She sat down at the table and opened the soup container like it was an invitation. We ate quietly for a few minutes. No pressure, no fixing. Then, gently, "You want to talk about it?" I shook my head, but I didn't change the subject. We sat there, 2 women in their 70s, eating soup in a kitchen that had once held so much noise. And I realized something. Ellen was the only one who still knocked before entering, but stayed even when I said nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, like it had swallowed all the air and left only memory behind. I tried to read, flipped through the same paragraph 6 times. The words didn't stick. I lit a candle. Vanilla and cedar. It reminded me of Maya's first apartment. I'd given her the exact same scent as a housewarming gift. She'd hugged me then, said it made her feel safe. Now I wondered if she even remembered. I walked to the window and looked out. Across the street, porch lights flickered on. Someone walked their dog. A car pulled into a driveway. And I stood behind the glass, invisible. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was drifting, like a piece of the past still taking up space in the present, a living relic. A story with no chapter left to write. I thought of the casserole dish still sitting clean in the lower cabinet. Of the voicemail I hadn't listened to. Just one ring, then silence. Of the emergency contact form the doctor had handed me last month. I'd paused before writing Julia's name, not because I didn't love her, but because I wasn't sure she'd pick up. I left it blank. The following morning, I opened the hallway closet and pulled down the wedding invitation binder. It had been mailed 2 weeks ago. White linen paper embossed in gold. I hadn't opened it yet. Now, I did. The envelope was crisp. The calligraphy neat, but the card inside was generic. No note. No, can't wait to see you, Grandma. No hand-drawn heart from Maya. Just a time, a date, a location. And at the bottom, Kendley RSVP by April 2. I checked the calendar. April 3. I stood there for a long moment, card in one hand, RSVP slip in the other. They didn't want me there. Or maybe worse, they didn't care if I came at all. There's a kind of silence that doesn't beg for attention. It just grows, settles into corners of your life until one day, you look around and realize you've been fading quietly for years. I folded the invitation back into its envelope, slipped it into the junk drawer between old batteries and unused coupons. Then I brewed a fresh cup of tea, sat at the table with my notepad, and wrote 3 names, Sikis Toms and Dexenistas. I underlined the last one twice. The tablecloth was pale blue with embroidered lace at the edges, the kind of detail you only notice when you're not really part of the celebration. I stood near the back, beside the drink station, holding a cup of punch that tasted like melted candy. The engagement party was in full swing. Laughter bounced off the vaulted ceilings of the rented event hall. Soft jazz played overhead. Maya's voice cut through it now and then. Bright, eager, young. I wasn't on the guest list. Not officially. I came because Ellen told me about the event. She'd overheard it from a woman at the market whose daughter catered the venue. That's how far removed I was. 3 degrees from my own granddaughter's milestone. Still, I'd pressed my blouse, polished my flats, and driven myself there, because part of me still hoped. Not for a warm welcome, just for acknowledgement. When I arrived, I lingered by the entrance. No one noticed me at first. Then Julia caught sight of me. Her expression froze just for a second. But it was enough. Mom, she said, walking over with that smile people wear when cameras are nearby. I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't invited, I said softly. But I heard. She didn't hug me, just adjusted the strap on her purse and said, Well, you're here now. I was here now. I stayed on the sidelines. Watched as guests circled Maya, handing her gifts wrapped in blush and gold. Watched as a slideshow played behind her. Childhood photos, vacations, holidays. There was one from the lake trip I remembered so clearly. Maya on Tom's shoulders, soaked in sun. They had cropped me out. The right edge of the photo showed half my arm, blurry and bent. I stared at it too long. Can I help you find your seat? A young woman in a black dress asked. One of the servers. She was maybe 20 with soft curls and kind eyes.
I'm fine,
I said. She looked confused. Are you at the groom's side or the bride's? Bride's. Technically. But I couldn't say it. Before I could answer, Julia stepped in. She's just dropping something off, she said quickly, taking my elbow with light pressure. Dropping something off. I was the delivery woman now. I pulled gently away. No, I said. I'm staying. Her face tightened. I really don't think this is the time, Mom. Neither was the shower, or the photo, or anything else lately. Guests were starting to glance over. Julia leaned in, whispering, Why are you doing this? I could ask you the same. Maya appeared beside us, smiling awkwardly.
Grandma,
She said, voice clipped. We're just finishing up the group photos. Maybe we can talk later. I nodded, but I didn't move. Peak 1 public humiliation continued. The photographer called out, Last call for family photos? Julia grabbed Maya's arm and led her toward the backdrop. I stayed where I was. I wasn't asked to join. I watched as a dozen people gathered. Maya's fiancé's parents, siblings, cousins. Even Julia's college roommate posed beside them, laughing like she belonged. Ellen always said a camera doesn't lie. But I was beginning to think maybe it just edits the truth. I stepped back toward the drink table, and that's when I heard it. A voice behind me. Male.
casual, almost amused. I thought she passed.
There was a snort of laughter, then the clink of ice in a glass. I didn't turn around. Didn't ask who said it. I just froze, not in anger, in recognition. Because to them it wasn't even cruel. It was believable. I had been gone from their world long enough that the idea of my absence had become natural, palatable, expected. I walked toward the hallway leading to the coach room. No one followed. No one asked where I was going. I stood inside the dim space lined with winter jackets and handbags and rested my hand against the wooden shelf above the coat rack. The walls smelled faintly of lavender and dry cleaning starch. I took a breath. Then another. I wasn't crying. That surprised me. I thought I might be. But no, what I felt wasn't sharp anymore. It was dull. The ache of erosion, not explosion. I gathered my coat, folded it over my arm, and opened the door slowly. As I stepped back into the hallway, I caught a flash of movement near the far wall.
Maya?
She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing, she was looking at me. Straight at me. Our eyes met for only a second, but something passed between us. Unspoken, taut, unfinished. Then Julia turned toward her and gestured for her to come back. And just like that, the moment broke. I left through the side entrance. Outside, the wind had picked up. It tugged at my blouse, lifted the edges like a braith trying to carry me off. I walked to my car without looking back. Inside, I placed my purse in the passenger seat, adjusted the mirror, and stared at my own reflection. Dropping something off, I whispered aloud like I was a bag of groceries, a cake, an errand. I started the engine. The radio crackled on, a soft country song playing, a voice singing about missing someone who used to sit by the porch swing. I turned it off. All I wanted was silence. Back at home, I didn't take my coat off. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the bench Tom built. And then, with slow fingers, I reached for the notepad beside the phone. Under the 3 names I'd written last week, I added one more. Us, but this time I didn't underline it. I drew a question mark beside it. The morning after the engagement party, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee untouched. The RSVP card still sat in the junk drawer. I could hear the edges of its paper brushing against a pack of expired coupons every time I opened it to grab a pen. I wasn't thinking about that today. I was thinking about the numbers. After the party, I couldn't stop replaying one line from Julia. We're trying to make things easier for everyone? See, easier for who? Not me. I went upstairs to the hall closet, pulled down the dusty file box labeled as estet, and sat cross-legged on the carpet. My knees cracked loudly, reminders of all those years on my feet at the hospital. Inside the box were copies of Tom's pension paperwork, insurance statements, and a list of every joint account we'd opened since 1984. I hadn't checked those accounts in a long time. Because I trusted them. Because I trusted her. I logged into the online portal and typed in the credentials, same ones Tom and I had used for years. It took 3 tries. When the account finally opened, I felt the first chill. The balance was lower than I remembered. Not drastically, but enough to make my pulse tighten. I clicked through the statement history. There, 3 separate withdrawals in the past 2 months. Large, labeled external fund reallocation. No notes, no explanation, and they weren't from my hand. I reached for the paper file again and found the original account agreement. My name listed first, Tom's second. No mention of Julia. I closed the laptop. I wasn't panicked. Not yet, but something in my gut, my nurse's gut, the one trained to feel danger before it shows symptoms, twitched hard. I changed out of my robe and into slacks, grabbed my cardigan, and slid the folder into my purse. By the time I pulled into the bank parking lot, the clouds had thickened overhead. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed. A woman behind the counter smiled politely. "Hi there. I'd like to speak to someone about account activity," I said. "Of course. Do you have your ID?" I handed it over. She glanced at the screen, then her smile faltered slightly.
Are you Margaret Bell?
"Yes," I said slowly. She hesitated, then stood. "I'll get Mr. Hartman." "One moment." As she disappeared through the back, I stared at the potted plant near the window. One leaf was dying at the tip, curling into itself. "Mr. Hartman emerged, a man in his 50s, kind eyes, loose tie. "Mrs. Bell?" he said. "Let's step into my office." We sat. He pulled up the account. "Looks like there's been some recent activity initiated by your authorized secondary." I blinked.
My what?
"Secondary account manager?" he said. "Added 3 months ago. Julia Bell." My spine went rigid. "I never authorized that." I said. He looked confused. "She submitted a notarized form." Standard practice. "Came with copies of your ID?" I felt the air thin. "Can I see the form?" He hesitated. "Would have to file a formal request." I nodded slowly. "File it." He folded his hands. "Of course. And Mrs. Bell, would you like us to freeze all external transfers in the meantime?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Yes." I left the bank with a copy of the freeze confirmation tucked deep in my purse, like a bandage no one else could see. The clouds outside had thickened into a full gray sheet, low and pressing. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the raindrops hit the windshield. Slow at first, then faster, like they'd been holding back. I didn't cry, I didn't shake, but I felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger, at least, not the loud kind. More like alignment? Like I'd just remembered who I was before everyone started treating me like I was fading. At home, I made tea and took out the yellow legal pad from the drawer where we used to keep Maya's school forms. I started a list. C1. Check all account beneficiaries. It's 2. Pull Old Will from storage. S63. Contact Tom's original attorney. 4. Talk to Ellen, see if she knows a private notary. I tapped the pen twice on the edge of the pad. Then I wrote one more item. Rs 5. Stop assuming good intentions. That one hurt the most. Not because I didn't want to believe the best in Julia, but because I had believed it for too long. And now I didn't know if she even remembered where the line between care and control was. Later that afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, the same one I'd used for decades, fixing my hair before work, checking my lipstick before dinner parties, holding Maya up in front of it so she could twirl in her Easter dress. Now, I looked at myself differently, not with judgment. With inventory, I still had sharp eyes. My back was straight. My hands, though veined and thin, were steady. I whispered aloud, "They think I'm slipping." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of how people treat you when they've already decided how the story ends. But my story wasn't ending. Not yet. I spent the rest of the evening going through every drawer, every folder, every financial statement. I pulled out the deed to the house, still in my name, found the account Tom had opened in my name only years before his heart gave out. It was small, but untouched. A seed. Before bed, I called Ellen. "I think they forged something," I said plainly. Her voice didn't flinch. "Okay," she said. "What's our next step?" I smiled despite everything. "Tomorrow, I want to visit the courthouse. See what's been filed under my name. You want me to come with?" "No. But be ready if I need a witness." She chuckled softly. "Always." After I hung up, I sat in the dark staring at the ceiling. Julia didn't know I'd gone to the bank. Didn't know the accounts were frozen. Didn't know I'd seen through the cracks. But I did. And now that I had, I wasn't going back to sleep. It was nearly 20:30 a.m. when I gave up pretending I could sleep. The sheets felt too tight. The pillow too soft. The room too still. I sat up, swinging my legs over the side of the bed, and stared at the faint outline of the dresser across the room. Tom's side of the closet hadn't been touched in 6 years. But tonight, I opened it. The scent hit me like a memory. Faint cologne and old cedar. A pair of boots still tucked in the corner. His work jacket worn at the elbows. A baseball cap faded to gray. I reached for the small box he kept on the upper shelf, the one labeled, "just in case." Inside were the usual things: a backup checkbook, a roll of quarters, a laminated copy of his ID, and a letter. My name was written on the envelope. The ink slightly smudged. I hesitated, then opened it. His handwriting was neat, careful, the same script he'd used on grocery lists and birthday cards. S. If you're reading this, Meg, I'm probably not around to say these things out loud. So here they are. I took a breath. F. I know you. You'll carry more than you should. Forgive more than is asked. And give past the point of empty. I also know you're stronger than you think. The tears came then. Silent. Not sobs. Just a slow slide down my cheeks like my body was releasing something it had stored too long. Don't let anyone tell you when your story ends. Don't hand over what you've built. Not out of guilt. Not out of fear. You've earned your name on every deed, every account, every photo on those walls. I folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope, fingers trembling slightly. He had seen this coming. Maybe not the specifics, but the drift? The slow, quiet erasure of the person who once made everything run. I walked downstairs and turned on a single lamp in the kitchen. Then I made a list on the back of a grocery receipt. It wasn't for groceries. It was for every account, every document, every piece of my life that needed reclaiming. Then I brewed tea, not for comfort, but clarity, and sat at the kitchen table until the sun started to rise. The walls changed color as light filtered in, shifting from shadow to soft gold, and with it came a calm I hadn't felt in years. Not peace, not yet, but direction. Tomorrow, I would take the first real step. I would become someone they didn't see coming. By 9 a.m., I was dressed in navy slacks, a clean blouse, and the same flats I wore to Tom's memorial. They still fit. I packed the documents neatly into my toady account summaries, the freeze confirmation from the bank, copies of the notarized forms Julia had slipped through, and the letter from Tom. Not to show anyone, just to keep close. Like armor, the courthouse was quiet that morning. I checked in at the records office. The clerk, a young woman with a sunflower tattoo on her wrist, led me to a computer station. "Just type your name here," she said, smiling. I did. The screen blinked, then a list popped up. Filings, petitions, access grants. My name again and again, some as petitioner, others as respondent. I clicked one entry and felt the air leave my chest. 3 weeks ago, Julia had filed paperwork requesting financial conservatorship. The petition claimed progressive cognitive decline, concerns from family, and inability to manage complex affairs. No doctor's note, no evaluation. Just a signature, hers, and a box check it ours temporary approval in court review. I pressed print. The page slid out slowly, each line confirming what I had only suspected. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about erasure, legal, public, permanent. I left the courthouse with the document clutched in one hand, sunlight too bright against the concrete steps. Ellen was waiting for me in her car. She didn't ask what I found, just looked at my face and started the engine. We drove in silence for a few blocks. Then I said, "She's trying to take everything?" Ellen nodded once.
I figured.
She said I was declining, I added. "To the court." Millen didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, "You remember last year, when Helen Stokes' daughter moved her into that wellness center?" I nodded. She went in for a sprained ankle. Ended up losing her house within 6 months. The road passed by in a blur of familiar houses and old trees. "I'm not going to end like that," I said. Ellen smiled, just the corner of her mouth. "No, Meg, you're not." We pulled into my driveway. I gathered my bag, my papers, my courage. Once inside, I placed everything on the table, smoothing the pages as I laid them out. Then I made one phone call. "Hi, I need to schedule a consultation. Yes, estate defense, and possibly a counter-petition." My voice was calm. Clear. I wrote down the date and time. Then I poured a glass of water, drank it slowly, and walked upstairs. By the time I reached the top step, the exhaustion hit me. But it was a different kind of tired, not from defeat, from motion. Because the tide had turned, and I wasn't swimming against it anymore. I was steering it. The office was small, 1 desk, 2 chairs, a window facing a brick wall. But the woman sitting across from me had steel in her voice and sharpness in her eyes. "Margaret," she said, folding her hands. "I've reviewed everything. You're not just dealing with a misunderstanding. This is a pattern." I nodded. "It started quietly," I said. "Little decisions. Little exclusions. And now it's institutional," she replied. "They're not just ignoring your voice. They're trying to legally remove it." I handed her the latest copy of the petition from Julia. Her brow furrowed. No medical documentation, no letters from physicians, and she filed as a sole caretaker. "That's concerning." "She's never been my caretaker," I said flatly. We went over everything. My original will, the existing accounts, the changes Julia pushed through without consent. Then she slid a form across the table. "Counter, petition. This will freeze any action until we're heard in court. But we'll also file a fraud claim on the notarized form. If you're up for it." I didn't blink. "I'm up for it." We set a court date. 2 weeks. I left the building feeling lighter. Not because it was fixed, because it had started. On the way home, I stopped by the print shop and ordered new copies of every critical document. 1 set for me, 1 for the court, 1 for Ellen. Back at the house, I created a folder labeled Tish Plan Bizur. Inside it, I placed Tom's letter, my deed, my banking power of attorney, now updated. I even called my old friend Marion, who ran a small retreat center upstate. "Do you still rent out the cabins in fall?" I asked. She laughed. "For you. Always. You finally taking that solo trip?" "Not yet," I said, "but maybe soon." I could hear the birdsong in the background on her end of the line. Peace, still far, but not unreachable. I hung up, then sat at the table and looked at my hands. A nurse's hands, a mother's hands, a woman's hands. They hadn't always been seen, but they had always held things together. And now, they were finally holding the pen. The silence in my home no longer felt empty. It felt strategic. Each hour became a quiet move. No announcements, no drama, just action. I began with the little things. I switched my primary email, changed every password, opened a brand new checking account under my maiden name. I moved a portion of my savings there. Not all, just enough to see who noticed. Julia hadn't called in days. Maya texted once. "Hope you're feeling okay. Things have been crazy here." No mention of the party. No follow-up. I replied simply, "All's well? Thanks for checking." Then I turned off my phone for 3 hours, just to remind myself I could. I went through the pantry and removed everything I had bought for them. The cereal Maya liked as a child. The gluten-free pasta Julia never finished. I boxed them quietly, labeled it Ausch donation, and drove it down to the shelter that evening. The volunteer smiled. "Bless you." I smiled back but didn't speak. I wasn't doing this for blessings. I was clearing the space. The following morning, I drafted 3 letters. One to my lawyer, confirming my intention to remove Julia as any future medical or financial proxy. One to the family accountant requesting a review of all shared access. And one to Maya. I didn't send it, I just wrote it. In it, I told her about Tom, about the way he used to hold her hand when she was scared, about the way he always said, "Courage doesn't make noise." Then I folded it and placed it inside the Plan B SARS folder. Because if this thing went all the way, she would need to remember who I had been before they told her otherwise. That evening, I made myself a proper dinner. Real linen napkin, wine glass, roasted vegetables, and salmon. I lit a candle, sat at the head of the table. No empty plates, no waiting for calls, just me and the quiet that finally belonged to me. On Sunday morning, I visited the notary office tucked between the florist and the tailor shop on Main Street. The woman behind the desk wore pearl earrings and recognized me instantly. "You're Mrs. Bell, right? I saw your name on the docket?" I smiled politely. "Just need to make a few things official." The pages were warm from the printer as I signed them, clean, direct, unshaking. The counter petition, the fraud alert, the updated proxy forms, the letter of intent to reclaim sole control of my estate. When I finished, the notary slid her stamp across each page like sealing a promise. "This will rattle a few cages," she said. "Good," I replied. "They've been too comfortable." Afterward, I walked down to the coffee shop where Tom used to take me on our off Fridays. The barista was new. Didn't know me. That felt right. I ordered a black coffee and sat near the window. Outside, the wind bent the trees backward, but they didn't break. A young woman passed with a toddler on her hip. The little boy pointed at a dog across the street, laughing, his whole body shaking with joy. I remembered Maya at that age, her curls, her laugh. She used to think I could fix anything. Back then, I could now. Now I was fixing myself. When I returned home, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out an old photo album. One with Tom's handwriting on the spine. Beginnings. He page after page of firsts. First house, first baby, first vacation. And somewhere between those snapshots, I remembered who I was when no one else was looking. Not a burden, not a placeholder, not a fading signature, but a woman who had built something worth defending. That night I slept, deep and undisturbed. No racing thoughts, no open tabs in my mind. Because everything was in motion now. The clock had started ticking for Julia, and I wasn't warning her. Because this time, justice wouldn't arrive with noise. It would arrive with paperwork, with timing, with silence. And when it did, it would already be done. The letter was printed on ivory paper, the font formal and precise. I had rewritten it 3 times before settling on this version, calm, clear, irrefutable. I folded it carefully, sealed the envelope, and wrote Julia's name on the front in my neatest cursive. Then I set it aside and picked up the next one. This one was for the bank, the next for the attorney, and the final one for Maya. Each envelope represented a door I had once left open. Now, I was locking them, for good reason. The court hearing was still a week away, but I wasn't waiting. I had seen what happened when people waited, when they hoped it would get better, when they confused kindness with inaction. My letter to Julia was not angry. It was instructional. Effective immediately, her access to all shared accounts was revoked. All medical and financial authority she once held was rescinded. A full audit would follow. She was not to contact the bank, the estate planner, or act on my behalf in any capacity. I had copied the attorney, the bank manager, and the notary. No wiggle room. No confusion. I signed each document with the same pen Tom used to keep in his shirt pocket. A small gesture, but it steadied me. After sealing the last envelope, I placed them in a small canvas tote, along with a fresh folder marked Osh effective 10:00 a.m. Friday. That would be the moment of the cutoff. No dramatic reveal, no shouting match. Just a change in the tide. At 8:30 that morning, I left the house with my hair done and coat pressed. I stopped at the post office and sent each letter by certified mail. Then I drove to the bank where Mr. Hartman met me personally. He handed me the final account reconfiguration forms I signed. He countersigned. We shook hands. Everything's in place, he said. Everything, I asked. He smiled. Every signature, every lockout, every safeguard. By 10 o'clock, your instructions are live. I thanked him and stepped out into the morning. The air was sharp, clean, like the first cold day after a long, humid stretch. I breathed in. This was the day everything began to turn, not with fury, not with fire, but with finality. At exactly 10:04 a.m., my phone rang. It was Julia. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, a text lit up the screen. "S, Mom. Did you change something with the bank?" I didn't reply. At 10:11, another call, then another. By 10:13, the voicemail box was full. By 10:23, she emailed me. "Subject there. Urgent, this is a mistake."
S body S, Mom.
I tried to transfer from the account for the wedding deposit and it bounced. "Can you call me, please? This is serious." Serious. It had only become serious when the flow of money stopped. Not when she filed legal documents behind my back. Not when she erased me from planning my own granddaughter's wedding. Not when she stood beside me and called me a burden with her silence. Just now, when her access vanished. By 1100, Ellen had texted too. She's calling around. Panicked. "You okay?" I said back, "I'm steady." Say at noon. I brewed tea and took out the folder labeled court hearing backup evidence. Every document Julia had filed. Every signature she'd forged. Every unauthorized withdrawal. I placed a printed transcript of her voicemail beside it. Then, for the first time, I opened the letter I had written to Maya. I had kept it sealed for days, unsure if I would send it, but now I needed to see my own words again. Inside, I had written, "You come from a line of strong women, but sometimes strength means choosing silence, until the silence becomes clarity." I didn't vanish. I was pushed to the edge and asked to stay quiet. Now I'm walking back in, on my own terms. I folded it again, placed it in a new envelope, and wrote only to be opened after Friday. It wasn't time yet. Let Julia run in circles. Let the money trail go cold. Let the silence speak louder than her spin, because by the time she realized I wasn't just reacting, I was building. It would be too late to undo. By mid-afternoon, the storm had moved from my phone to my doorstep. I saw Julia's car before I heard the knock. She stood outside with her coat half zipped, holding her phone like a weapon. I didn't open the door right away. I watched her through the side window as she shifted her weight, lips tight, eyes scanning. Then came the knock. 3 short taps. "Mom," she called. "Can we talk?" I opened the door halfway. Her eyes scanned my face, searching for softness for an opening. I gave her neither. She launched into it. "I just got off the phone with the planner. They said the deposit bounced, and then the bank said I'm not on the account anymore." "What is happening?" I said nothing. She stepped closer. "I need access back, okay? This is all a misunderstanding. You didn't tell me you were making changes." I met her gaze steady. "No, I didn't."
Why not?
"Because you didn't tell me when you added yourself in the first place." She blinked. "That was for efficiency. I didn't think." "You didn't ask?" I cut in. She drew a breath. "We're family, so is trust," I said. "And you bypassed it?" She stepped back half an inch. "You're making this harder than it needs to be?" I nodded slowly. "I know." She folded her arms. "So what now? You just cut me out?" "No," I said calmly. I cut myself back in. Her eyes flickered. And for the first time in months, she didn't have a script ready. Behind her, the wind rustled the trees. "You're going to embarrass all of us at that court hearing?" she muttered. "I won't need to," I said. "Your paperwork will do that on its own." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Julia," I said quietly, "you've been preparing for a future where I disappear. I'm just showing you what happens when I don't." She looked down. Her voice wavered. "Maya doesn't need this right now." "No," I said. "But I do." I closed the door gently, not slamming it. Just enough to make the message clear. Inside, the house was still. I exhaled, not in victory, in return to control, to dignity, to self. Julia would spin. She'd rant. She might even try to fight, but it wouldn't matter. Because the foundation was laid. And I was standing on it again, both feet planted, facing forward. The next morning, I watered my plants as if nothing had happened. The African violet bloomed again. Small, defiant bursts of purple. I hadn't expected this late in the season. I stood by the windowsill, sun warming my hands, and thought, sometimes resilience looks like softness refusing to die. Julia didn't call that day or the next. Instead, I got a polite, impersonal email from her attorney. "We'd like to propose a mutual resolution before the hearing. Please confirm a convenient time to discuss. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to my lawyer with the subject line, not interested in detours. That Friday, Ellen dropped off lemon bars in a tin wrapped with a gingham ribbon. She didn't ask questions. She just said, they'll spin. Let them. You just keep walking straight. I smiled.
That's the plan?
Later that afternoon, I opened the hallway closet and pulled down the suitcase I hadn't touched in years. It was Tom's. Still had the airline tag from our 25th anniversary trip to Maine. I placed it on the bed, opened it wide, and began to fill it. Not as an escape, as a statement. I wasn't running, I was choosing. Books, comfortable clothes, the letter from Tom, the new deed copies, my folder labeled Splenbis. Everything essential, nothing sentimental. By the time evening came, the bag was zipped and waiting by the door. I sat in the living room, lights off, just the golden haze of the floor lamp casting soft shadows across the rug. And that's when I heard it. A knock. Not Julia, softer. I opened the door to find Maya standing there. No coat. Just a cardigan pulled tight around her, like she'd left in a hurry. Her eyes were rimmed with something. Fatigue, maybe? Or shame? Grandma, she said. Can I come in? I nodded and stepped aside. She looked around the living room like it was a museum of memories she'd forgotten how to walk through. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For not asking more questions. For not noticing. I didn't say anything. She sat on the edge of the sofa, hands in her lap. I don't know how we got here. I did. But I let her speak. I don't want to lose you. Not over all this. I sat across from her. You didn't lose me, I said. You just stopped looking. She swallowed hard. I'm looking now. We sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that doesn't ache. It listens. Maya fiddled with the edge of her sleeve. I thought Mom had everything handled, she said. She always made it sound like you were overwhelmed. Tired? I nodded slowly. I was tired. But not from living, from being erased. She winced. I didn't know how deep it went. I leaned forward. That's the thing about quiet betrayals, they're polite. They wear concern like perfume, but underneath they rot. Maya looked up at me. Are you leaving? I glanced at the suitcase. For a while, just some space. A cabin upstate. Your grandpa and I always talked about going back. Never did? She hesitated. Can I visit? I studied her face. Older now, no longer the child who braided my hair with wildflowers, but somewhere in her I saw the girl who used to reach for my hand during thunderstorms. If you come, I said, you leave the noise behind. No guilt, no pretending. She nodded. I can do that? 'Cause she stood. I don't know what Mom will do, she added. She's spiraling. I didn't respond right away. Then, let her? Maya's lips parted as if to argue, but she stopped herself. Instead, she walked over and hugged me. Tight, real. I love you, Grandma. I know, I whispered. Just remember that when they start rewriting the story. She pulled back, tears slipping down her cheek. I'll help tell the right one. After she left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her walk down the path in the same way she used to skip as a girl, slower now, heavier, but still hers. Inside, I turned off the lights one by one. Each click felt like closure. I moved through the house, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of picture frames, the worn handle of the kitchen drawer where I kept recipes no one asked for anymore. Then I sat at the table, pulled out one last envelope, and addressed it. Says Judge Marianne O'Connell, Heist Douglas County Courthouse. Inside, I placed a copy of my timeline, my evidence, my letter of declaration. A full account, no dramatics, just facts and voice. Before sealing it, I added a note at the bottom. This is not about punishment. It's about return. So I signed it, folded it, and placed it with the others. The lake was still. Mist hovered just above the water, like breath waiting to settle. I stood on the small wooden porch of the cabin, hands wrapped around a chipped blue mug. Coffee steam rose in steady spirals, warming my face against the October air. It had been 3 weeks since the hearing. The judge ruled swiftly. Julia's petition was dismissed. Lack of medical basis, breach of fiduciary trust. My authority was fully restored. The court transcript read like a list of corrections. But to me, it was quieter than that. It was permission to live again on my own terms. I rented the cabin for the entire season, longer if I chose. No one knew the address but Ellen and Maya. The first few days I didn't unpack much. I let the silence breathe through the rooms. I opened the windows, watched the leaves turn amber. Then I began to move. I walked the trail behind the cabin. I chopped vegetables slowly, deliberately. I wrote long letters to no one, just to empty my head of leftover noise. And I started something new. On the second Tuesday, I hung a hand-painted sign above the fireplace mantel of the quiet shelf. It wasn't a library, not officially. But I began placing books there. Some I brought, some I found at the local thrift. With each title, I added a handwritten note on the inside cover. Stories about starting over. About reclaiming your place in the world. About not disappearing. One morning, I returned from the market to find 2 new books had appeared on the shelf. No note, no name. Just editions. That was the moment I knew. The healing wasn't just mine anymore. It was spreading. Maya arrived the following weekend. She didn't bring much, just a backpack, a notebook, and a half-used bottle of peppermint tea she claimed helped her think better. She stood on the porch for a while, eyes wide, soaking in the stillness. "This place," she said softly, "it feels like it remembers." I nodded. Some places do. Inside, she explored like a child again, touching the spines on the quiet shelf, fingering the curtain seams, holding a pine cone she found by the firewood stack like it was made of gold. We made soup together that night. She chopped onions while I stirred, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we didn't talk about Julia. Didn't talk about the court. Didn't talk about what had been lost. Only what was left to build. When we finished eating, she stood by the bookshelf and ran her finger along a title. "Can I leave one too?" she asked. I nodded. She placed her journal there, spine out, no label. "You sure?" She smiled. "It's only half written, but maybe someone else will finish it." The next morning, I watched her walk down the gravel path toward her ride. She turned once, waved and mouthed, "Thank you." I didn't wave back. I just pressed my palm over my heart. She knew. That afternoon, I sat at the porch table and wrote a short note, just one sentence. S. If you've been made to feel invisible, this shelf is for you. I slipped it inside a weather-safe frame and nailed it to the front post. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the tree line and the wind tugged gently at the lake's surface, I sat with Tom's letter in my lap, folded, worn, but still whole. I whispered aloud, "We're okay now." The fire crackled behind me, and somewhere in the trees an owl called out, not urgent, not afraid, just there, like me, no longer waiting to be seen, but choosing to be. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. This story was inspired by real moments many women over 65 quietly carry, stories of being overlooked, pushed aside, and reclaiming dignity not with noise, but with quiet power. What would you have done if you were in Margaret's shoes? Leave a comment below. Your voice matters more than you know. Have you ever faced a quiet betrayal? Share it. Your story could help another woman find her strength. You're not invisible. You're not alone. You're still writing your legacy. Let's talk in the comments.